Hello, good evening. My name is Brian Leib. I'm the Executive Director of the Iranian Americans for Liberty. On behalf of our Board of Directors and Advisory Board, it's my honor to welcome all of you to this evening's webinar. This evening, we will hear from two highly respected foreign policy experts, Mr. Elon Berman and Mr. Sean Durns, on the topic of, do the American people benefit from American diplomacy with Iran? But before we get started, I'd like to tell you a little bit more about our organization. The Iranian Americans for Liberty are a bipartisan group of Iranian Americans from all around the nation, coast to coast, that are working together to strengthen and support U.S. foreign policy and national security solutions that are bringing democracy, human rights accountability, and freedom of speech to Iranians that are living under the oppressive Islamic Republic of Iran. So that's a little bit more about our group. Please visit our website, which is www.ia4l.org to learn a little bit more about our organization. So at this time, it's my distinct pleasure to hand the program over to this evening's moderator, Adelle Nazarian. Adele, the floor is yours. And guys, have a great conversation. Thank you again for making the time.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Brian. Welcome, everyone.
Pleasure.
Thank you. Welcome to this evening's webinar, everyone. My name is Adelle Nazarian, and I will be the moderator for this evening's conversation, as Brian mentioned. Before we start our Q&A, though, I'd like to read a short bio about this evening's special guests. Our first speaker this evening is Mr. Ilan Berman. He is the Senior Vice President of the American Foreign Policy Council in Washington, D.C. Mr. Berman is an expert on regional security in the Middle East, Central Asia, and the Russian Federation. He has consulted for the U.S. Central Intelligence Agency, the CIA, as well as the U.S. Departments of State and Defense, and has also provided assistance on foreign policy and national security issues to a range of governmental agencies and congressional offices. Mr. Berman has been called one of America's leading experts on the Middle East and Iran by CNN. Mr. Berman is also a member of the Associated Faculty at Missouri State University's Department of Defense and Strategic Studies, MISU. A frequent writer and commentator, he has written for the Wall Street Journal, Foreign Affairs, the New York Times, Foreign Policy, the Washington Post, and USA Today, among many other publications. Thank you for joining us. Our second speaker this evening is Mr. Sean Durns. He is a senior research analyst for CAMERA, the 65,000-member Boston-based Committee for Accuracy in Middle East Reporting and Analysis. His writings have appeared in a variety of outlets, including the Washington Examiner, Newsweek, Fox News, The National Interest, and many others. Mr. Durns has a master's in diplomatic history from the London School of Economics, otherwise known as LSE. Gentlemen, thank you so much for joining us this evening. We would like to turn it over to you both for brief opening remarks at this time before we get started with our Q&A. Mr. Berman, let's please start with you.
Oh, sure. Thank you. And it's a delight to be here. It's nice to see you, Adele. Nice to see you, Brian. Nice to see you, Sean. So I look forward to the time when we can do this not in little squares on my screen. But in the meantime, this is great. So I just want to spend a couple minutes sort of setting the scene for this discussion, because I actually think that we take a lot of things for granted when we talk about the Biden administration's Iran policy, when we talk about sort of what the motivations are, and a lot of assumptions, and I think incorrect assumptions, are baked into where we see the administration heading. The first I think the first major point here is that the conventional wisdom that has sort of surrounded the Biden administration's pivot on Iran is that the maximum pressure policy of the last administration was a failure. And objectively, as somebody who not only sort of watched it closely, but sort of worked with the administration on a number of things relating to it, I can tell you that's simply not true. Maximum pressure is not a failure. What you can say is that maximum pressure was a work in progress, right? But you can already see, right, the withdrawal of the United States from the Jcpoa in May of 2018 was followed by a very significant and very broad-based economic campaign to try to whittle down the Iranian regime's resources and whittle down its ability to project power externally. And by the time election season rolled around last year, the effects were already beginning to compound. And so you had Iranian oil exports, which were down by something like 90% in terms of Iran's ability to sell oil on the open market. You had a cratering of the Iranian national currency, the rial. You had Iran beginning to eat into its own foreign exchange reserves. The World Bank and the IMF estimated that as of early this year, Iran only had $4 billion in readily available foreign exchange reserves that it could call upon. And so what you saw was that maximum pressure was actually really significantly beginning to bite in terms of what the Iranian regime was doing. So begs the question, right? Why the reversal? If this is working, why the reversal? And I would say, maybe I'm wrong, and maybe my analysis is incomplete, but I think there's really three things that we need to think about here. The first is that American politics always, but especially in recent years, has been very much a pendulum and sort of swung very wildly one way from one direction to the other. And therefore, when the Trump administration, when President Trump was still candidate Trump and he was on the campaign trail, he made withdrawal from the Jcpoa a core campaign issue. And it only stands to reason that an administration that and a presidential candidate in Vice President Biden, who campaigned on being the anti-Trump and sort of being the having a very different foreign policy, would also highlight the sort of the return to the Jcpoa as being one of his core priorities, and that's exactly what happened. The second sort of reality I think that we need to deal with that intends to inform the Biden administration's Iran policy is, there's a saying in Washington that personnel is policy. And I think that's very true. And it's particularly true in the context of Iran policy, because if you look at the upper echelons of the Biden administration, what you see is people like Secretary of State Antony Blinken, like National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan, like Deputy Secretary of State Wendy Sherman, like Iran envoy Rob Malley, that were principals in the conclusion of Jcpoa 1.0, in the conclusion of the Iran nuclear deal under the Obama administration that took place in 2015. And therefore, if these are the same people who are shepherding and being the stewards of Iran policy now, it stands to reason that what we would see would be more continuity than change, but not continuity from Trump's maximum pressure policy, continuity from the Obama administration and its approach to Iran. And I think that's precisely what we're seeing. And the last point I'd make is I also think that the Biden administration is animated, at least in part, by a fairly profound misunderstanding of internal Iranian politics. There's a myth, as all of you know, there's a myth that's sort of circulated in the discourse, in the American discourse about Iran for a long time, that posits that there's this existential struggle between hardliners and moderates, reformists that's taking place. And if we engage with the moderates, we'll empower them in this struggle against the hardliners and the conservatives in the Iranian body politic. But the reality is that that idea is mostly fiction. What we're actually looking at is much more of a struggle between the Iranian people themselves and the elites, the clerical elites in the Iranian regime. And the first place, or sort of the most recent place we can look to sort of understand this is at the way the selection criteria for the upcoming Iranian presidential polls played out. The Iranians go to the polls next month. The selection criteria has weeded out certainly everybody who has a different ideological take than the mainstream of the regime elites. But it's even weeded out, disqualified people like people who would be considered hardliners. The former Iranian president, Mahmoud Ahmadinejad, for example, didn't make the cut. People like Ali Larijani didn't make the cut either. And so what you see is a very, very narrow band of acceptable public opinion among people who would rise to the upper echelons of the Iranian regime. Where you see the real difference, and hopefully we'll get into this sort of in our conversation, is between the Iranian people and what they want and what they aspire to, what they believe, and what the regime is holding them back from. And so I think that's really where the center of the conversation is. But that's not where the administration is focusing right now.
Thank you so much, Mr. Berman. Mr. Durns, the floor is yours for your opening remarks.
Thank you. Good evening. My thanks to Brian, Adele, and Ron, and the Iranian Americans for Liberty team for having me. First, I should begin by noting that my organization, the Committee for Accuracy in Middle East Reporting and Analysis, is nonpartisan and does not take policy positions. What camera does deal in, however, are facts, and the facts are, in this instance, quite clear. When Brian asked me nearly a month ago if I would be interested in appearing on a panel entitled, "Is the JCPOA good for Americans? Is diplomacy good for Americans with the regime?" I was glad to say yes. The answer, I thought, was clear. Well, today, a month later, with the war between a key U.S. ally, Israel, and Iranian proxies being blared across newsrooms all over America, the answer is, I will argue, undeniable. As I need not remind our listeners and viewers, many of whom know far too well the nature of the regime in Tehran, the Islamic Republic is an imperialist revolutionary regime, which is committed to spreading the very same terror that is meted out to its citizens to others throughout the Middle East. And I look forward to delving into this further, especially thanks to Ilan for setting the stage here. And we'll get into this.
Thank you so much to both you gentlemen for those opening remarks. We're really honored to have both of you here with us this evening. For the next portion of our program, we kindly ask for both our special guests to keep their remarks on each question to under 5 minutes. Let's get started. The first question is for Mr. Durns, and then to Mr. Berman for the same question. The topic of this evening's webinar is, do the American people benefit from American diplomacy with Iran? So let's start there. Do they benefit? Do the American people benefit from diplomacy with Iran?
That's a great question. It's certainly a timely one. Winston Churchill once observed that fate holds terrible forfeits for those who gamble on certainties. I think that's very apt. Diplomacy with the regime in Tehran has been predicated on a few certainties, which are far from certain. One is that economic incentives, to include sanctions removal, will incentivize the regime to moderate its behavior. The second assumption, and this was certainly a view of the Obama administration, is that the regime will restore balance to the region. This deeply flawed sectarian view holds that Islamist terrorists like Al-Qaeda and ISIS have plagued the region for years, and that Iran, a Shia majority nation, can provide balance. But this is not a Europe looking for a balance of power, and the proponents of this view are not Kissinger's, much less Metternich's. Finally, and perhaps most importantly, the other key assumption is that no harm comes from talking. Diplomacy can only be a positive. This too, however, is flawed. Indeed, all of the assumptions have one key problem, and they fail to understand the nature of the regime itself. The idea that economic incentives can change the behavior is based on the flawed premise that all countries share the same values, that we all want the same things, and thus can be induced by similar incentives. This is known as mirror imaging, and while that might be true for many of the Iranian people, it is certainly not true for the regime. The regime in Tehran isn't like the administration in DC. It's revolutionary. It's hell-bent on spreading its perverted and diluted ideology throughout the Middle East, in much the same way that a century earlier, Lenin, Stalin, and Trotsky were determined ideological revolutionaries. And that ideology, of course, to be clear, is fiercely anti-American, anti-Western, and anti-Semitic. It allows for embracing and funding terrorist groups of all sectarian stripes in its war on the West. Engaging with such a regime without acknowledging its fundamental tenets, its core ideology, is costly. And we're seeing some of those costs right now.
Thank you so much. Mr. Berman?
Sure. No, it's a great question. And I think certainly for people who sort of have focused on this and who are sort of watching the Iranian regime's international behavior, the answer is pretty obvious. But I actually think that it's useful as we think about the potential harms and the potential benefits from this deal to ask ourselves a series of questions. So the first one, I think sort of the entry level question is, why the JCPOA again? Because, look, I advisedly am not a fan of the framework that was cobbled together by the Obama administration and our European allies in 2015. But if you were predicated, or if you were inclined to sort of to believe that this was a good framework, it's unclear to me how a framework that is now more than 50% expired naturally serves the American people. Because remember, the JCPOA is not indefinite. It has sunset clauses. Certain provisions that accompany the JCPOA in 2015 have already fallen away, like the arms embargo or the embargo, the UN imposed embargo on the sale of conventional arms to Iran, which expired in October of last year and has not been renewed and has not been has not been replaced. And so, certain other provisions, key provisions fall away in 2020, 2023, 2025. By 2028, the JCPOA, as currently constructed, as we're trying to re-enter, is effectively a non-factor. And therefore, it seems very silly to me, even if you are inclined to assume that some sort of nuclear deal with Iran is a net benefit for the United States, why you would decide that this deal, instead of a new, updated, stronger, longer deal, is in America's interest, because I don't think it is. The logical follow-on question is, will the Iranians play ball? Because remember that the Biden administration's idea, the whole sort of concept that it has evolved here, is that we need to re-enter the JCPOA first as a prerequisite for a longer and stronger deal with the Iranian regime. But it takes two to tango. And so I think a very valid question is to ask, well, okay, it's clear why the Iranian regime wants to return to the 2015 JCPOA, because the sanctions relief that it received as a result of that deal were very significant. And there's all sorts of signs that we're heading right back into that framework. But what's going to compel the Iranian regime, if we're giving them all the sanctions at the front end of the negotiations, to conclude a deal that is more constraining on their international behavior, that involves more things, like their support for regional proxies, like their ballistic missile program? That doesn't seem nearly as good a bet for the Iranian regime as simply re-entering the JCPOA is. And the third question, which delves into what I mentioned in my opening remark, is, are we talking to the correct Iranians? And here, I think you can cut that question two ways. First of all, are we talking to the correct Iranians within the regime? Because famously, the Iranian Foreign Minister Javad Zarif, in comments that to this documentary project that were leaked to the press, said recently, or opined or complained recently, that his ability to conclude some sort of agreement with the United States was really hampered by the Iranian military, in particular the clerical army, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. And here, it's useful to remember that the Iranian president, the Iranian foreign minister, in fact, all of the what could be called the secular institutions of the Islamic Republic are overlaid by clerical ones that actually hold the decision-making power. Most important of all is the post of the supreme leader himself, who is the ultimate decision maker here. So it's, I think, necessary to understand that we're not talking with the decision makers. We're talking with people who would be decision makers in our analogous environment, and that's not the case. And the second line here is, are we talking to the correct Iranians in the context of the regime or the people? Because if memory serves, when the Obama administration was very new in its foreign policy, was right around the time of the fraudulent re-election of Mahmoud Ahmadinejad to the Iranian presidency. And I remember distinctly that the administration decided to cast that fraudulent re-election and the groundswell of popular discontent that emerged, that became known as the Green Movement, as strictly a domestic matter, because it's very gauche to negotiate with a regime and then support the people who are trying to overthrow it at the same time. Right? You fully understand, right? Logically inconsistent. However, it really demonstrated to me, and I think to a whole lot of other people, that the dynamism that's inherent in Iranian society resides very much on the street, and very little, if at all, among the the unelected clerical institutions.
Yes.
And so for the long-term projection, or for the long-term trajectory of the country, we have to keep that in mind, because we could very well strike a deal that may mollify certain people now, but will cost us our ability to influence Iranian policy over the long term.
Thank you so much. And that may very well be a reason why Mahmoud Ahmadinejad or Larijani, for example, were precluded from taking part in this upcoming election, June 18th, because they are more populist candidates. As you said, the policy does rest with the people, not the people in charge there. Well, thank you, gentlemen, for those responses. For our next question, let's talk about the double standard in play regarding a long-standing American foreign policy position that we, the United States of America, do not negotiate with terrorists. And as we all know, the Islamic Republic regime of Iran is the world's leading state sponsor of terrorism and has been for decades. That said, why does the current administration think diplomacy with the world's largest state sponsor of terrorism bear fruit for the American people? Mr. Berman, what is your response first?
Sure, I'll answer briefly. I think I want to hear Sean's response as well. But to me, the proper analogy is actually relates back to an American politician who is now deceased, by the name of Daniel Patrick Moynihan, who was at one time the senior senator from New York. And he wasn't a foreign policy guy. He was a criminal justice scholar. And he coined the term defining deviancy down to talk about how the New York criminal justice system was essentially turning a blind eye to misdemeanors. And it created this cycle where petty crimes became more significant crimes. But I actually think that's a really good lens to think about Iran in the context of both the Obama administration and the Biden administration. Our problem with Iran does not begin and end with the Iranian nuclear program, but we have made a choice to define Iran's deviancy down and not focus on Iran's support for terrorist proxies in the region, not focus on the regime's corrosive ideology, and instead just to focus on something that we think we can marginally affect, which is the pace of Iran's movement towards a nuclear program. Now, notice even there in that modest goal, we haven't derailed Iran's pursuit of a nuclear weapon. We've only marginally slowed it and only done so temporarily, but at an enormous cost, where we no longer talk about Iran's sponsorship for terrorism, Iran's fomentation of instability in places like Yemen and Syria, and in Iraq itself. Candidly, I think that's a huge mistake, because by focusing on one aspect of Iran's rogue behavior, even though it's a very significant aspect, we tend to not see the forest for the trees.
Thank you so much. Mr. Durns, please, if you would give us your response as well.
Yeah, well, I think that's really the million-dollar question, of course, is why does the administration think that diplomacy with the world's largest state sponsor of terrorism will bear fruit? In fact, the entire reason why Iran's nuclear program is such a problem, such a threat, such a menace, is because of the nature of the regime itself. As Ilan said, this is a regime that, is the leading state sponsor of terrorism. It is imperialistic and revolutionary in nature. And this is what makes the nuclear program such a key threat. And by choosing to focus on that instead of the rest of Iran's behaviors, you miss the entire picture. So I think that a lot of it is, I think, and this was alluded to also in earlier remarks, this is an attempt to do a third term for the Obama administration. Personnel is absolutely policy. You have a bunch of people that are committed believers that think that this was the way to go. They're back in the saddle. They've got new positions now, but they haven't changed or readjusted their thinking, unfortunately, over the last several years, which did show that things like maximum pressure were having a significant effect. And we see now that we've gone back to the previous thinking, just what that reaps. And the last couple of months, you've seen Iran in the march elsewhere throughout the region, and not just with its proxies in Gaza, but in Lebanon and Iraq, where dissidents were assassinated today, certainly in Yemen. So there's a huge disconnect between reality and what certain people think. And I'd cite another Moynihan quote, which is, everyone's entitled to their own opinion, but not their own facts. And the facts in this case, I think, are right, looking us smack in the face, and they're pretty brutal. So.
Yeah, thank you so much. There seems to be a difficulty these days with people accepting fact as reality. A different topic, of course, for a different discussion. But speaking of negotiations, as we talk now, there are ongoing negotiations happening in Vienna regarding the Jcpoa. The US State Department has confirmed that sanctions relief is on the table as part of re-entering the Jcpoa, of course. Do you think that sanctions relief is appropriate? And, more importantly, will it change the behavior of the Islamic Republic of Iran? Please, Sean, I'd like to go to you first for this.
Okay. Well, looking across the Middle East right now, as I said, we see Iran on the march, embarked on an accelerated campaign of assassinations in Iraq, Lebanon, one of which is a de facto vassal state, and the other well on its way, if not already there, tragically. In Yemen, we see the Houthis on the march, and in Gaza, and yes, even in the West Bank, we see an Iran whose proxies armed and equipped by Tehran are more bellicose, more emboldened since our engagement and promise of sanctions relief, not less. There is no evidence to suggest that the ruling clique in Tehran will take this sanctions relief and invest in the Iranian people, as several Obama administration officials once hoped. Rather, they will invest in the destruction of peoples and peace throughout the Middle East. And there's plenty of evidence to indicate that that's the case, as we tragically see. And I would also note that one thing that we really haven't seen in the media regarding the recent war between Israel and Hamas, which was all over all the front pages, is that this was also, by the IRGC's own admission, them trying to apply pressure on U.S. negotiators in Tehran. So there is just a great example of how the regime works and whether things like economic incentives matter to the people in charge in Tehran. And they don't.
Thank you. Mr. Berman.
Sure. Well, I think it's a great question. From my perspective, I think sanctions relief is totally not appropriate for a very simple reason. Iran hasn't done anything yet. And so I find particularly pernicious this dynamic of giving sanctions relief without actually giving it that's taking place on the part of the Biden administration. Because the Secretary of State, in his confirmation hearing before Congress, pledged that the Biden administration's Iran policy would not give Iran sanctions relief until Iran actually made concrete commitments, made concrete reinvestments in the Jcpoa. But in practice, the Biden administration is already doing that, not by allocating money, but by rolling back its enforcement of existing sanctions. Because Iran's business partners, whether they're nation states like China or their corporate entities, understand very well that US sanctions, if they're in effect but not enforced, aren't really in effect at all. And so with a wink and a nod, there is a much more permissive attitude towards, for example, Iran reflagging oil tankers to different nationalities and selling oil abroad. There is less punitive action being taken against Iranian illicit money transfers. And there's all sorts, the conditioning of this environment is such that the Iranian regime, I think, is very well justified in understanding that the Biden administration wants a new deal very badly, and it's willing to turn a blind eye to deformities in Iranian policy, even in advance of actually formally allocating sanctions relief. But there has been at least one pledge on the part of the administration to allocate sanctions relief. So a couple of weeks ago, the Biden administration, as a sweetener for the regime, mentioned the idea that they were considering the allocation of $1 billion in humanitarian aid to assist the Islamic Republic with COVID relief, which is was immediately taken by the Iranian regime as a sign of American eagerness to get back in the deal, as American capitulation. Honestly, if this does transpire, right, in addition to creating all sorts of questions that one would hope Congress would ask, it would sort of denote I think, a very, very obtuse policy, not because the Iranian people don't deserve humanitarian aid, but because any money that's allocated directly from the US government to the Iranian regime is sure to be spent more on guns than on butter. A much better idea, for example, would be for the US government to say that in support of humanitarian purposes in Iran, it was willing to allocate $1 billion worth of coronavirus vaccines and put the regime on notice that the US and the Iranian people, inform the Iranian people that the US is willing to assist with the Islamic Republic's COVID crisis, and put the regime in front of some hard questions about why it wouldn't be willing to accept Western aid. That's, I think, a smarter strategy, but I think the overall tenor here is very, very clear. The picture that's emerging is that the Biden administration is doing everything in its power to sweeten the pot, even before the Iranian regime makes concrete commitments to reinvest in the Jcpoa let alone any longer and stronger deal that may come about as a result.
Absolutely. I think early on, even when there was an attack on US positions in Iraq, I believe it was, or Syria, there was the US response was not actually equal. There were people taken out for our side, and the Biden administration opted to take out a abandoned unit that housed Iranian assets. So we're seeing point taken for what both you and Mr. Durns had elicited. So for our next question, I'd like to ask both of you, to what extent has the US government evaluated the risk of drastic change in the political structure of Iran in the midterm against the potential benefits of a comprehensive deal with the mullahs in power? Can you think of a scenario where the US government is left footing the hefty bill of violence against civilians perpetrated by the regime in order to prevent political change, losing significant political capital and moral standing? First question for you, Ilan.
Sure. Well, no, I think that's precisely the right question, because what you see on the part of the Iranian regime is the potential for history to repeat itself. And I mentioned a few minutes ago, I mentioned the aftermath of the emergence of the Green Movement, the signal that the Obama administration sent to everybody, but in particular to the Iranian regime, that this was an internal matter. The U.S. was not going to weigh in. The U.S. was seeking some sort of bargain, and therefore the U.S. wouldn't articulate its ideas about what was happening within Iran. And that created the permissive attitude that allowed the Iranian regime to clamp down on the Green Movement, to go online, to throttle the Green Movement online, to persecute its leaders. It really sort of set the stage for a half decade of repression that set the movement, the pro-democracy movement in Iran, back substantially. And I worry about this sort of cycle repeating itself again, where the United States, very eager to conclude the same deal or a new deal with the Iranian regime, is turning a blind eye to the human rights deformities within Iran. And I think that's dangerous in the near term. It's dangerous because it incentivizes the Iranian regime to be more brutal and to lay right on top of the Iranian people as they seek a better, more pluralistic, more moderate future. And it's also dangerous, I think, in the long term, because the long game in Iran policy has never been about the regime. It's always been about the people. Iran is a country of what, 84, 85 million people. 2/3 of the population is 35 or younger. They were not alive when the Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini stepped off the plane at the airport in Tehran. They are not bound to the regime the way, ideologically, the way the upper echelons of the regime, who are much older, clerical elites, uniformly infirm, are invested in this governing structure. And so for them, what the regime does internally and what the regime does internationally actually matters a great deal. And watching what they do and watching what they want and what they say, I think is of paramount importance to American policymakers, because they, much more than the regime that rules them, is sort of the barometer, the accurate barometer of the pulse of the Islamic Republic, or more accurately, the pulse of Iran, not just the Islamic Republic. And so I worry about any arrangement that the United States makes that incentivizes the Islamic Republic over Iran.
Thank you. Sean, if you would please give us your response as well.
Certainly. So sadly, yes, I could envision such a scenario where the U.S. government is left footing the hefty bill of violence against civilians. This is an important point. The notion that there's no harm in talking, that diplomacy is always better than war, is false. It's a false dichotomy. The regime in Tehran is also at war with its own people. And by helping to fund that war, by filling Iran's coffers, the U.S. risks losing credibility with not only the Iranian people themselves, but with key regional allies. We had several substantial peace agreements that were made between Israel and several Arab countries, for example. There's numerous instances in which this plays out on a wider scale. Nothing happens in a vacuum. And I would add that other human rights abusing regimes, including Beijing and Moscow, will be watching as well. That this goes beyond just the Middle East. and you see appeasement and turning a blind eye to human rights abuses and not standing with the people, well, that resonates far beyond Iranian borders.
Thank you so much. Yes, I believe it was about a month or two ago, they actually were able to find and they apprehended, I think, 2 Iranians that crossed over into the US border, into America. So you're absolutely right. It's not just Syria, Libya, Israel, the Palestinian issue. It's definitely a US national security issue as well. So for our last question, I would like to shine a spotlight on something we've briefly touched upon: the human rights abuses, the atrocious human rights record, and abuses that are coming out of the Islamic Republic of Iran on what seems to be a daily basis. Of course, they're so good at concealing this that we don't have a good barometer or measurement of how often these things actually occur. We believe it's a daily basis and can say that with conviction. The Iranian Americans for Liberty have recently launched a campaign to raise awareness about recent headlines regarding Vahid Afkari. Vahid's brother, Navid, was a famous Olympic wrestler that was executed last year for alleged crimes against the Islamic Republic of Iran. Now, many believe that he was forced into giving a false confession, another common scenario with this regime. These barbaric actions from the Islamic Republic of Iran are nothing new. Do you think if the average American, everyday Americans, knew about these human rights situations in Iran, that they would speak out against these atrocities? Let's go first to Ilan.
Sure. I think that's a great question, because I absolutely believe that there needs to be much more attention and much more effort made to publicize the internal state of play in Iran, not just the political state of play, which we know a little bit about, but as I would argue, probably not as much as we should, but the human rights abuses and sort of, the showing the true nature of the regime. And here, I think there's this interesting dynamic that's in play. The Trump administration, when it was in office, famously articulated 12 points as prerequisites for normalization with Iran. And, ranging everything from greater nuclear transparency to the withdrawal of Iranian military forces from Syria and sort of everything in between. One of the things that wasn't articulated was a real sort of fulsome focus on human rights. To its credit, the administration may not have articulated it, but they did a great deal during their time in office to try to publicize human rights abuses on the part of the Iranian regime. This gets, I think, far less attention now than sort of the more public dimensions of maximum pressure, but it's worth noting that there was a tremendous amount of outreach that was made to the Iranian people, and there was a tremendous amount of attention that was paid to human rights conditions within Iran. But I think it's true, and it's objectively fair to say that the administration could have done a great deal of additional pressure, right? One of my inherent problems with maximum pressure, I don't like the name because it connotes that we've done everything we can. But in the last 4 years, we really haven't activated the human rights dimension with regard to Iran at all. We haven't applied new sanctions. We haven't done independent monitoring. We haven't pressed our allies to do the same. There's a great deal that we can do here. And, not to be uniformly negative, I think there's actually an opportunity for the Biden administration to play in this arena in a constructive fashion. The Biden administration has, for its own reasons, has really elevated the question of human rights in its foreign policy, for example, its China policy, its policy towards Saudi Arabia and others. And I think all of us, frankly, should seize that opportunity and take them at their word. Fine, let's talk about human rights conditions within Iran. Let's have a discussion. Let's even though you're negotiating with Iran, we can't turn a blind eye to what's happening within Iran. And if we do that enough, and if we're vocal enough, I actually think that there's at least some opportunity for those of us that are concerned about human rights in Iran to shape the contours of the administration's Iran policy on that front.
Yeah, I would simply add that campaigns like that and the work that Iranian Americans for Liberty is doing is absolutely crucial. As someone who monitors Western coverage of the Middle East for a living, I can tell you with absolute certainty that Western news outlets are not talking about this. They are, in fact, actively minimizing and ignoring the human rights abuses that the regime inflicts on its own people. It's absolutely important to highlight these crimes and to make the broader American public in the world aware of what the Islamic Republic is doing. That's a tool. It's not only the right thing to do and a healthy thing to do, but it's a key weapon, and it was used to great effect, for example, against the Soviet Union. So there's no reason why it shouldn't be used against a similar imperialistic regime. It should be, and it's crucial.
Adele, you're muted right now.
Oh, thank you guys. Sorry about that. So I was going to say, so exactly what you said, and having events like these that raise awareness, having you gentlemen here really voicing these facts and really countering in a lot of ways the narrative that has been trying to stifle the reality on the ground. It's just so important, and the more people that can be reached this way, it's definitely gives hope to the American people and the Iranian people, everyday people who look to gentlemen like yourselves and the work that Iranian Americans for Liberty does to make sure this is more apparent, the atrocities are occurring in Iran. Well, thank you, gentlemen. We have reached our time limit for this evening's conversation. On behalf of Iranian Americans for Liberty, I want to thank you for taking the time to connect with our community, and I'd like to give both of you the opportunity to provide some brief closing remarks before we wrap up for the evening. Tell us, what is your message to the Iranian American community? Let's start with Mr. Durns.
Thank you. And thank you again for having me. The work that you guys do is absolutely crucial, and it's just so needed right now. My message is simple, if a bit corny. Marshal Ferdinand Foch, the great French general of World War I, once remarked that the most powerful weapon on earth is the human soul on fire. And it's one of my favorite quotes. I'd have to agree. The human spirit is indomitable. And while I've spent quite a bit of time tonight discussing the fervent and twisted ideology of the regime in Tehran, I remain confident that it too will be left on the ash heap of history, like totalitarian regimes before it. For that to happen, however, will require a lot of work and dedication, but it is by no means impossible. This is a blip. If you look at Iran's long, long history, this is a blip. Those who 50 years ago opened up détente with the Soviet Union, for example, did so in part on the assumption that the Soviet Union was here to stay. That was the operating ideology of the Nixon and the Kissingers at the time, the so-called realists. They were wrong. The Soviet system was inhumane and was unsustainable. And there's a broader lesson in that, and I think that applies to the regime in Tehran as well. Thank
you so much. And Mr. Berman.
No, I couldn't agree more. I think Sean said it very well. The one thing I would add is that I am convinced that facts are stubborn things. And the more the American people learn about internal conditions within Iran, the more they learn about the nefarious nature of the Iranian regime, the more support Iranians and Iranian Americans can count on from the United States in precisely this mission. Right? Iran is not a status quo regime. Iran, as it's currently constructed, is a radical revisionist regime that seeks to change the status quo in the Middle East and that sees the United States as a mortal enemy. But it doesn't have to be that way. And so I think the center line of US policy, whether Republican or Democrat, liberal or conservative, needs to play the long game, needs to look at how best the United States can empower the forces in Iran that would make Iran an ally of the United States once again. And that, to me, that's a sort of a transpartisan sentiment. I think it makes a lot of sense whether you're a Democrat or whether you're a Republican, because it makes good strategic sense from the US national security interest to promote a more liberal, more free, less repressive, less ideological government in Iran. And so thank you guys for having me. This has really been, I think, a wonderful conversation. And thank you for the work that you do.
Thank you so much. And just to both of your points, it's just so funny, if I may also point out that you're absolutely correct. If they look to the forces and the factors within Iran that actually do determine what the people actually want, you look historically and you see that human rights, for example, I should have mentioned this earlier, was actually the first human rights doctrine ever created was by King Cyrus of Iran, the great Persian Empire. So it's only natural that the US and the Iranian people should have a natural alliance, speaking historically. With that being said, I thank you again for your time, Mr. Berman, Mr. Durns. In closing, the Iranian Americans for Liberty thank everyone for joining us this evening. Until next time, I'm Adelle Nazarian. Have a good evening.
Thank you, guys. Adele, fantastic job. Have a great night, guys.
Thank you.
Thank you.